Ladies and gentlemen, a line was crossed tonight that most people never even knew existed until they heard it explode across their screens. In a townhouse outside Toronto, a small business owner named David is staring at a muted TV while his laptop screen shows a spreadsheet bleeding red. His shipping costs are up. His interest payments are up. His American clients are suddenly revisiting terms. He thinks he's dealing with another round of tariffs. Then he reads the caption under Trump's face and feels the ground shift. Canada has been free riding for 30 years. They owe us. It's time they pay a special defense contribution. He doesn't read NATO communiques. He doesn't quote Article 5. He just knows one thing: when an American politician turns his country's security into a bill on a stage, someone like him is going to pay. Ladies and gentlemen, a campaign line just collided with a lifetime of trust. Within hours of that rally in Michigan, Ottawa answered in a way that left no room for creative interpretation. Canada owes the United States nothing. We don't fund campaign speeches. That is not theater. That is not witty banter. That is one ally telling another on the record that the debt being shouted about on stage does not exist in law, in treaty, or in reality. You need to understand something. This is not just about harsh words. This is about the moment when a core security relationship, NORAD, NATO integrated radar joint exercises, gets dragged into the same rhetorical mud as trade deficits and campaign fundraising. In the first few seconds, it sounds like classic Trump free riding, bills, pay up or go alone. But look at what just happened to David in that townhouse. His bank has already called him twice this quarter to review exposures. His U.S. customers are under pressure from their own uncertainty. Now he has to ask himself a new poisonous question. If they start treating Canada's defense as an unpaid invoice, what happens to my contracts when the next round of pressure hits? Here is the part nobody saw coming. For decades, Canada and the United States could lock horns over lumber, dairy pipelines, and tariffs and still keep defense above the waterline of political spectacle. There was trade tension, but there was also a quiet assumption: the sky over North America, the radar nets, the early warning systems, those were not up for sale. Tonight, that assumption cracked. Trump did what he has done before with Germany and other NATO allies. He recast a complex burden-sharing arrangement as an overdue bill, but this time he aimed it straight at the neighbor that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. You think this is about NATO paperwork? It isn't. It is about whether trust itself is now priced by the rally. Somewhere in Edmonton, a family just locked in a mortgage renewal at a higher rate than they expected. They don't link that directly to a special defense contribution, but when they see the Canadian dollar dip, when they hear analysts suddenly talk about heightened North American risk, the invisible line between geopolitics and grocery bills gets thinner. And in Halifax, a retired Air Force mechanic who served in joint exercises with U.S. pilots is shaking his head. He remembers shared missions, shared risks, shared funerals. He hears the word free riding and feels something deeper than anger. He feels erasure. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not rumor. It is a systemic signal. That sentence from Ottawa, "We don't fund campaign speeches," is more than a clapback. It is a legal correction, an economic line in the sand, and an institutional warning. Legally, it rejects the idea that there is any enforceable debt under NATO or NORAD that allows a president to invoice a single ally. Economically, it refuses to package alliance logistics and shared security as a product that can be individually billed and publicly collected. Institutionally, it says there is a difference between a serious burden-sharing conversation and a theatrically invented special defense contribution. Let me repeat that. The money Trump is talking about does not exist as an obligation. He is not collecting. He is inventing. But invention at this level is not harmless. It creates expectations where none should exist. In Washington, some will hear that phrase and quietly ask staff, so what exactly does Canada pay? What don't they pay? Can we quantify this free riding? In certain corners of media, a narrative will form. Canada owes billions in protection they never paid for. That narrative will be repeated, simplified, weaponized. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, the response will not be emotional. It will be strategic. They will not scramble to cut a check for a fictitious bill. They will examine where their leverage actually lies. A senior official will look at NORAD modernization timelines and think, if this becomes a pattern, which upgrades do we accelerate? Which do we slow? And with whom do we diversify? Another will quietly strengthen ties with European and Indo-Pacific partners, not as an act of revenge, but as a hedge against a future in which Washington treats alliance commitments as transactional theater. Ladies and gentlemen, do not look away from the word hedge, because once an ally starts hedging against you, they are telling you something you may not want to hear. I trust you, but not enough to bet everything on you. In a condo in Vancouver, a young couple running a cross-border e-commerce business are doing their own version of hedging without ever using the word. They shift a portion of their supply chain from U.S. warehouses to a European logistics provider. They diversify their payment channels. They reduce their exposure to a single political climate. They don't care about NATO clauses. They care about invoices they can actually pay. You think this is a diplomatic quarrel. It is actually a household risk event multiplied by millions.
As markets open in Asia, traders see the headlines scroll across their terminals. Trump demands Canada pay up on defense. Ottawa rejects claim. It is not the most dramatic headline of the year.
But it is another chip out of a perception that for 75 years made North America feel like the world's most predictable security partnership. The shield of invincibility has shattered, not yet. But tonight, a hairline fracture is visible to those who know where to look. Ladies and gentlemen, look carefully at this. When defense guarantees are discussed as unpaid invoices, they stop being guarantees and start being conditional offers. And conditional offers in geopolitics are an invitation for adversaries to test the fine print. In NORAD command centers, officers will continue to do their jobs. Radars will continue to sweep. Data will continue to flow. But in the political layer above them, a new precedent has been set that one side can publicly imply the other is not paying its way and demand a bespoke contribution as if this were a private security firm. The system is creaking under pressure, not because any wire has snapped yet, but because the weight on the language holding it together just increased. Ladies and gentlemen, what happens in the next 70 hours will decide whether this stays a rhetorical flare or evolves into structural pressure. In those hours, Ottawa will calibrate its language carefully, firm enough to defend its position, calm enough to avoid panic. Washington's more experienced voices will try to frame the comment as just politics, even as they privately beg allies not to overreact. NATO officials will draft sentences that sound reassuring while avoiding any confirmation that defense now comes with itemized pricing. And in living rooms across Canada and the United States, people like David and that Halifax retiree will decide something fundamental. Do I still believe this relationship is solid, or do I start quietly preparing for a more fragile North America? Because once that belief shifts, you cannot legislate it back into existence. But what comes next is far worse. Stop, because once the language of alliance becomes the language of billing, ladies and gentlemen, every lever of the economy begins to tremble in its socket. Let me be clear about this. We are no longer talking only about what is said on a stage. We are talking about tariff-induced inflation, real income erosion, institutional credibility, and the silent recalibration of capital behavior. Start with the bluntest instrument, tariffs. If a narrative takes hold in Washington that Canada owes us for defense, some faction will eventually argue that tariffs are an appropriate way to balance the books. It is a short, politically convenient step from accusing an ally of freeriding to slapping their imports with so-called security adjustment measures. In Mississauga, a manufacturer named Rosa runs a small firm producing metal components that cross the border several times before they become finished goods. Every extra tariff round, every new bureaucratic hurdle eats into her margins. She has already postponed buying a new machine, already frozen, hiring already, raised prices twice. Now she hears that Canada is being framed not only as a trade surplus problem, but as a defense debtor. In her mind, those worlds merge into one simple fear. If they punish us for defense, my next shipment will cost more than the contract is worth. You think this is about abstract security doctrine. It isn't. It is about whether Rosa can renew her line of credit next spring. Tariff-induced inflation does not care whether its origins lie in a misunderstanding of NATO rules or a deliberate political strategy. It only cares that goods cost more to cross borders. Each extra cost is a grain of sand in the gears of the real economy. Household pressure builds quietly. Wages do not leap every time a politician opens a new front in an alliance dispute. Paychecks move slowly, if at all. But grocery prices, fuel costs, and mortgage rates can move faster. In Winnipeg, a family of four watched their grocery bill creep higher month after month. They have not changed their diet. They have not upgraded their car. They have only upgraded their anxiety. They hear talk of Canadian free riding and paying us back and wonder if their country's going to be punished. Will that punishment arrive through the aisle they walk every week? Ladies and gentlemen, these are real economy consequences. and they create conditions for something even more dangerous, political volatility. Now consider the risk of shutdown and federal paralysis. In Washington, budget talks have become hostage to every other issue. If the special defense contribution narrative hardens, some lawmakers will demand that any budget reflecting NATO commitments be tied to collecting what allies owe. Others will refuse to let security be used as leverage in fiscal negotiations. The result is stalemate. Foreign allies watch appropriations fights and wonder whether commitments can be trusted. Domestically, agencies begin operating under temporary resolutions, unable to plan long-term. Institutional credibility erodes one deadline at a time. This is not rumor. This is not speculation. This is how a single narrative that allies owe money they never actually agreed to owe starts to chip away at the reliability of the largest political and financial system in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand something else. Regulatory fog is not just produced by regulators. It is produced by uncertainty about what politicians might demand next. In Montreal, a logistics company plans to expand its cross-border warehousing. It needs clarity on customs, rules, security screenings, and the political climate that might change them. When it hears that an ally's entire defense relationship is being framed as an unpaid bill, it quietly inserts an extra column in its risk matrix, alliance volatility. That one column can delay a decision for months. Capital behavior responds. Investors, especially institutional ones managing pensions and insurance portfolios, see alliance volatility and begin to adjust. They do not dump everything at once. They shift gradually to more cash, safer bonds, shorter commitments. They keep more powder dry. This might look prudent, but it amplifies structural pressure. Cash held back from productive investment is potential growth withheld from the real economy. Plants not built, workers not hired, innovations not funded. Each is a small subtraction from future prosperity. Here is the part nobody saw coming. The louder the rhetoric about demanding payment from allies, the more those allies are tempted to diversify away from the very system that is demanding it. This creates a confidence fracture at the core of a financial order that depends on trust in rules, not moods. Ladies and gentlemen, when confidence fractures, markets do not always scream. Sometimes they merely grow cautious, and caution repeated across millions of decisions is a slow-acting poison. Diverging economic indicators begin to tell the story. Official growth might hold up for a while. Unemployment might stay low on paper. But if you look closer, you will see business investment slipping, productivity growth stagnating, and wage gains lagging behind cost of living increases. Misalignment creeps in. Politicians will point to the healthy indicators. Households will feel the unhealthy ones. Businesses will live in the delta between the two.
In Calgary, an energy firm debates whether to commit billions to a cross-border infrastructure project that will last 30 years. Its analysts are not only modeling oil prices and carbon policy,
they are modeling something much harder to quantify. How predictable will the U.S.-Canada security and political relationship be over the life of this asset? If the answer is less predictable than before, the required rate of return rises. If that rate cannot be achieved, the project dies on a spreadsheet long before a single pipe is ordered. This is the feedback loop at work. Political messaging about allies owing us creates systemic tension. That tension alters capital behavior. Altered capital behavior affects real economy consequences like wages, prices, and jobs. Those consequences feed public frustration. Public frustration feeds more aggressive rhetoric. Ladies and gentlemen, the system is creaking under pressure. Do not look away from the strain on SMEs. Small and medium-sized enterprises are the first to feel the pinch and the last to be rescued. They lack the buffers of multinational corporations. They cannot afford teams of lobbyists in Washington or Ottawa. A small exporter in Saskatoon sees a modest shift in currency and a new rumor of tariffs tied to defense contributions and wonders if it is worth renewing its U.S. contracts at all. They might pivot to another market or simply close the export side of their business. All of this multiplied is structural erosion. Not dramatic, not celebrated, but cumulative. Inside political parties, fractures open. In the United States, factions argue over whether to double down on billing allies or return to the older language of partnership and shared values. In Canada, parties debate how firmly to push back without turning economic pain into a patriotic badge. Fractures in party structures feed misalignment in policy. One administration courts Canada, another humiliates it, and markets must price not just the current government, but the volatility between governments. You think elections reset everything. They don't. They merely change the slope of the trends that were already in motion. Market caution becomes a permanent feature, not a temporary reaction. Ladies and gentlemen, look at the supply chains. Rerouting is not an overnight event. It is a series of small decisions, one supplier swapped, one port avoided, one insurance clause rewritten. If Canada concludes that it must hedge against North American political swings, it will deepen trade, financial, and security ties with other partners, not as a dramatic break, as a quiet repositioning. And each repositioning is another piece of realignment in the global order. The feedback loop tightens. Alliance rhetoric alters supply chains. Supply chains alter economic leverage. Shifts in leverage alter future rhetoric. Because the long-term damage hasn't even begun to reveal itself. Stop. Over the long arc of 10 to 20 years, ladies and gentlemen, the true cost of this moment will not be measured in this quarter's currency moves or next year's tariffs. It will be measured in structural erosion, institutional decay, and the slow recalibration of trust. You need to understand something about institutions. They are not just buildings and acronyms. They are habits of cooperation, of restraint, of reflexive solidarity that take decades to build and can be quietly undone in far less time. For most of the post-war era, the instinctive answer to any major shock touching North America was simple. Canada and the United States will coordinate quickly and deeply. NORAD, integrated command, shared intelligence, joint exercises, all of these were manifestations of that instinct. Now imagine a world 20 years from now in which that instinct has been blunted by decades of rhetorical strain. Whenever a crisis hits, a cyber attack on critical infrastructure, a confrontation in the Arctic, a sudden incident involving a rival power, decision makers will not only ask, what is our plan? They will also silently ask, what will this cost us politically? Will we be accused again of free riding or of paying too much? That hesitation is the scar tissue of institutional decay. Markets smell uncertainty. They always have. They will not only smell it in stock volatility or commodity prices, they will smell it in the subtle, repeated signals that alliances once thought unshakable are now contingent on domestic applause. In Ottawa, future governments may decide that every major cross-border initiative must include a diversification clause, some way to pivot if Washington turns the partnership into a campaign prop again. In Washington, future administrations may find that when they truly need Canada for Arctic surveillance, for diplomatic leverage, for integrated deterrence, the automatic yes they took for granted has been replaced by a careful calculation. You think alliances are permanent features. They are not. They are long-term contracts written in the language of shared benefit and enforced by trust. Arithmetic does not negotiate. If the perceived benefits decline and the perceived risks rise, the equation changes, no matter how noble the rhetoric sounds. Ladies and gentlemen, consider generational memory. A generation that grew up with seamless border crossings, integrated economies, and a sense that their northern and southern neighbors were immovable anchors will over time absorb a different message that even the closest of allies can be. Publicly insulted, billed, and threatened for short-term political gain. In that environment, hedging is not paranoia. It becomes the default. Canadian policymakers will talk more openly about diversification, about building redundancy into supply chains, about ensuring that no single political cycle in Washington can upend their economic security. American policymakers seeing this may interpret it as disloyalty rather than rational planning. The misreading becomes another layer of misalignment. Misalignment between intentions and interpretations. Misalignment between legal commitments and political language. Misalignment between what markets expect and what voters are told. You cannot spin a grocery bill when long-run alliance fragility translates into higher transportation costs, bigger risk premiums baked into pricing, and more expensive imports. There is no speech that can make checkout totals feel like a victory. In Toronto, a woman named Sarah sits at her kitchen table paying bills. She does not care about NATO burden-sharing formulas. She cares that her rent is higher, her food is more expensive, and her pay has not kept up. She hears once again that her country is being described as a free rider. She feels instinctively that something is off. She is paying more, yet being told that Canada doesn't pay. That dissonance weakens faith in narratives from all sides. Institutions matter. They mediate dissonance. They provide continuity when political personalities change. They offer a stable frame within which markets and households can plan. But when institutions are repeatedly used as props, when NATO becomes a backdrop for slogans about unpaid bills, when NORAD is implied to be a service that can be switched off without consequences, the long-term damage is subtle but relentless. The next time a leader stands up to defend an alliance commitment, the words will land on thinner ice. Ladies and gentlemen, think of trust as capital. You can build it, you can spend it, and you can waste it. For decades, the U.S.-Canada security relationship accumulated trust, capital joint operations, integrated commands, crisis coordination, shared sacrifice. In just a few rhetorical cycles, a portion of that capital has been spent without any corresponding investment. Over 20 years, if that pattern repeats, the account runs low. At that point, even well-intentioned leaders find themselves constrained. They may want to rebuild, but their publics are wary, their markets are unconvinced, and their partners are hedged. Markets smell uncertainty, but they also remember it. They remember where contracts were broken, where rhetoric diverged from treaty, where commitments were turned into domestic weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to see the bigger loop here. If Canada quietly strengthens alternative partnerships, if European and Indo-Pacific states note the instability in North American rhetoric, if capital flows shift toward blocs that appear more predictable in their alliances, the relative position of the United States changes. Not in a single spectacular moment, in a long series of reallocations, repricings, and realignments. The United States will still be powerful. Canada will still be prosperous. But the web that once held them in a uniquely tight, almost taken for granted embrace will be looser, more conditional, more transactional. And a transactional alliance is far easier to disrupt. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the naked truth. You cannot bully an ally into permanent loyalty, and you cannot invoice your way back to the kind of trust that makes deterrence real. Arithmetic does not negotiate. If the numbers of trust, cost, and benefit stop adding up on both sides, the system adjusts whether leaders acknowledge it or not. You cannot spin a grocery bill. You cannot spin a mortgage payment. You cannot spin an empty order book.
Over the next 2 decades, the legacy of this special defense contribution episode will not be remembered for the exact words used on stage.
It will be remembered for what it revealed, that the line between domestic performance and structural stability had become dangerously thin. Ladies and gentlemen, do not look away from that lesson. Alliances are like compounding investments. They grow slowly when carefully tended and can be quickly damaged by reckless withdrawals. Institutions matter, not because they are flawless, but because they store and transmit trust across time.
Whether North America's institutions emerge from this period bruised but intact or hollowed out and fragile will depend on choices made long after this rally is forgotten.
It will depend on leaders who resist the temptation to send theatrical bills to countries that have already paid in blood, in treasure, and in shared risk. It will depend on publics who demand something better than short-term humiliation of allies as a substitute for strategy. And it will depend on whether markets, households, and businesses still believe that when it truly counts, the commitments carved into treaties are stronger than the words shouted into microphones.
Ladies and gentlemen, the future is not yet priced in, but the direction of travel is clear enough for anyone willing to read the signals honestly.